Welcome to Inside Track with Bruce Ash and Eb Wilkinson on the Live the Dream Media Network.
Hello, everybody, and a very pleasant good morning to you, wherever you may be. Bruce Ash and Eb Wilkinson coming to you live in color from the Ultralux Essential Pest Control Studio, along with Tucson Crime-Free Coalition leader and hero, I think, Kevin Daly. Thanks for joining us.
The man who never sleeps.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Eb. Thank you.
In just a few minutes, we'll be connecting with former Baltimore police officer and nationally respected criminology expert Peter Moskos, talking about his new book, Beyond the Brink. I think you're going to enjoy this a lot, to discuss his newest book, his fifth, and the state of public safety in America. But I hope you will support our sponsors who help us pay the man here at Live the Dream. My broadcast partner, Eb's great company, is amongst our advertisers, Wilkinson Wealth Management. Our friend Eric Rudin at Essential Pest, Jamie Kipper at Tucson Iron and Metal Retail, and our own three-generation company, real estate company, Paul Ash Commercial Real Estate. When you call them, including my office, let them know you heard about us and you found them from Inside Track. Thanks all of you for joining us today for a serious discussion that's on the mind of so many Americans, as well as here in Southern Arizona as well. And that is crime, public safety, and criminal justice. To talk with us or our guest speaker, our guest today, Peter Moskos, call 520-771-5101 or send a message to us on Live the Dream Media Facebook page. Peter Moskos, thanks very much for joining us today on Inside Track.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to share what others have said about your new book, Back from the Brink. Let me open this up just a little bit because I'm practically blind. So retired top cop Bill Bratton writes, there has been no shortage of books that have attempted to tell this story, including three of my own. He's doing a little self-promotion there. But from my perspective, this is one of the best. This is Back from the Brink. I learned so much about the department and people I've known for years. Read it, and you will be very glad you did. Your book has also been well received by the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, New York Times. Pulitzer Prize columnist Clarence Page said about Peter's newest book, Back from the Brink is a unique and compelling story of New York City, told by the people whose individual voices and experiences are frequently flattened and marginalized in service of grand theories of the criminal justice system. So you didn't serve in the New York police. You were in Baltimore, as I said. Why did you write Back from the Brink? And tell our audience how you use the voices of law enforcement officers to help tell that story, Peter.
I was an unusual cop. I was only there for less than 2 years. I was a PhD student in sociology at Harvard and went to Baltimore to conduct my PhD research. When I first went there, I wasn't planning even on becoming a cop. So that was a various twists of fate. I wrote about that in Cop in the Hood. That was my first book. But the time frame of this, I started grad school in 95. I worked in Baltimore from 99 to 2001. 95 and 96, murders in New York City had dropped 50% from 1990. And I'm reading all these so-called experts in the field saying that that's impossible, that the only way to reduce violence is to address root causes, which means, poverty, racism, unemployment, education. And I will be slightly dismissive of that. I don't want to say those things aren't important, but none of those things were getting better. And no, we don't have to fix society to prevent crime and violence. And I thought, wow, if the whole academic field is wrong, it's probably a good field to get into. So, I was like, what is going on in New York City? And so that seed was planted from day one of my grad school career. And then, flash forward decades. And I'm working at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I know a lot of cops in New York City now. And, so I ask them, and partly I'm thinking, well, I know there's this thing called CompStat. I know Bratton was commissioner. But how does a weekly crime meeting in the form of CompStat actually stop people from shooting each other in the street? And that's the question I didn't really have the answer to. And I figured the best way to get to the answer is ask the people who were there. I did my first interview in 2014. It's been more than 10 years of research. Not not continuously, every day, but and very quickly I realized I can't write a typical academic book on this, or I shouldn't. Why am I going to paraphrase what these cops are saying when they're saying it as well as anybody could say it, and they have such great voices? And I thought of the old Chicago legend Studs Terkel, who wrote books, oral histories about work and the Depression and many books. And I thought, I want to do something in that style and let these people speak for themselves and tell their own stories. So I weave together a narrative told. I mean, I do the chapter introductions, but told entirely from the perspective, mostly of police officers. There are a few other people in there as well, starting in the 70s and going to the sort of mid to late 90s.
What was the most revealing thing that you learned in this sort of a journey of probably 8 or 9 years, doing these chats with active police, former police, people around the police, that you took into this book to kind of put things together? Is there any one or maybe several of them?
Well, to me, and originally I thought the time frame of the book would be later, and then I realized, no, the story does cover those decades from when these men and women came on to when murder was down drastically. Um, and it was the dysfunction of the city and the police department throughout the 70s and 80s and into the 90s that and by dysfunction, I mean they didn't focus on crime. I don't want to say they didn't care about crime, but as an organization, they didn't care about crime. They focused on preventing corruption, preventing scandal, preventing race riots, and then, making 3 arrests for every 10 robberies that were committed. That was, a lot of people talked about that. As long as you did that, life was good. You had job protection, you do your time and get a nice pension. And the idea, at some level, the crime reduction was because of a change in the mission statement, as sort of boring as that may sound. The rest of it's hard work. But the idea that, we're going to care about crime. And the best illustration of this, in 94, Bill Bratton gets appointed police commissioner by Giuliani, and his right-hand man is this transit cop, Lieutenant Jack Maple, who was the mind behind a lot of what happened. And Jack Maple started asking NYPD police chiefs, how many people were shot last year? It's a legitimate question. And nobody knew. It's hard to fathom today that a police department, much less the NYPD, doesn't know how many people are shot in the city. They simply weren't keeping track. And he said, well, let's go, let's look at last year being 93, and let's count them all, because it's out there. It's not that we're not keeping the data, it's just we're not collecting it. And it turned out there were 5,866 people shot in New York City in 93. We still don't know how many people were shot in the city in 1990. The most violent year. It was probably close to 7,000 people. And they simply weren't counting it. Well, that's step one. Why don't we gather the information, figure out where they're being shot, when they're being shot, who is doing the shooting, and let's go after them. We got an army here of, nearly 40,000 cops at this point. Let's go get them. And that hadn't been done before. So it was a real revolutionary change in what the goal of policing actually was.
Is that the sort of thing that you thought to yourself, yeah, duh? I mean, how could you not?
Yeah. Well, yes. And Jack Maple was kind of aware of that. He's often called this genius, and he was a very smart guy. But he's like, this isn't that complicated. I make a little 4-step plan. I mean, again, the hard work comes after that, but you first have to care. And one thing I try and do in this book is show that they do care. They care about the city. They care about the people getting shot. They're vested in the city. They don't want the city to go to hell, quite frankly. And it had gone to hell, and they wanted to bring it back. And that took, that took political support, and it took good policing and also prosecution. I mean, I don't want to say policing was the only thing, but I do think it was the major thing. And so many lives were saved. I want to add one thing that Bratton said. I thank you for reading that blurb he did for my book. He actually called me and left a message on my answering machine later. And it's such a good line. And he said, I learned so much about the people and organization I've known for so long. And I love that line because I do try. I mean, I'm not interviewing the people about their personal lives, but I start every interview. There are about 30 different people in the book. I did many more interviews, but you have to make choices. And I asked them what their parents did. And I want to show that these men and women come from humble backgrounds, that many of them became cops, not because they had lifelong dreams to, though some did, but because they took all the city tests, and the police department called first. And then they embraced the job, and they did it well.
I'll open this up to Eb and Kevin.
Yeah. So, Peter, Governor Hochul, in response to subway attacks, called in the National Guard to help keep order on the subways. Good idea, bad idea? What are your thoughts?
Bad idea. And it's bad because, first of all, National Guard are not police.
Right.
Second of all, perception does matter. And I don't want to say perception is everything, because reality matters too. But the idea that you had to call and look, I ride the subway most days of the week. I've had issues on the subway, but by and large, it's fine. Not all, I mean, it could be better. I don't want to discount the problems, but the idea that you have to send in the National Guard because it's out of control is bad on a perception level. But it's bad on a policing level because they're just standing there like scarecrows. They're not police. What matters is policing as a verb. What matters is enforcing subway rules. That is the part that requires political support. And that is, so Bratton was the transit police chief, which was a separate police department at the time before he was NYPD commissioner for the first of his 2 terms as commissioner. And when he was transit police is really where the crime decline started. And it's a great natural experiment because robberies went down on the subway and they didn't go down above ground. So it's sort of, again, the root causes aren't any different, but the subway system recognized that people saw the subways as out of control, and they started with turnstile jumping. And it wasn't that was the greatest problem, but it was symbolic of the greatest problem, and it allowed them to stop people who were going to commit other crimes. Most turnstile jumpers were not going to go and rob somebody, but a lot of them had outstanding warrants. Well, great, we got them. So a fair number had weapons.
So this is kind of like the broken window theory. Take care of it at the lowest common denominator level and move from there?
Very much they use the broken windows theory. I do think the broken windows theory is often misunderstood because you can take care of the little things and the robbers still might rob. It is really, you have to focus on the repeat violent offenders. But broken windows did allow police a legal and moral and effective reason to stop people for legitimate rule violating. If you didn't have an open warrant and you weren't carrying drugs or a weapon, you get a ticket and you were released. That was that. But it did say, look, whatever you're going to do, don't do it. You're not going to do it on the subway anymore. And the immediate decline in felony crime surprised even them at the time. And so then that philosophy was basically taken above ground where there was more crime and it was a little more complicated. But let's focus on, it was crime mapping, basically gathering the intel, which is, there are great stories about the people, the guy who wrote the code for CompStat, the program. At some level, it was, it was nothing more than a timely crime map, but it was at a time that people were wowed simply by a PowerPoint presentation, basically, when the world was still using overhead projectors. That was the only real computer element of it. They could have done it by paper, but they did this, and it was a system of accountability. That's the key part. It wasn't the presentation as much as saying, okay, you're the precinct commander. We're going to give you the resources you need, but you have to tell us what your plan is, and you have to bring down crime. And if you don't bring down crime, you have to have another plan. But the important thing is you have to care, and you can't just say, well, sometimes crime goes up and sometimes crime goes down. That was no longer an acceptable answer anymore in the organization.
So what I'm excited to hear you use the word accountability. You're talking about it in terms of the organization, but what about the people? Isn't that significant that starting holding people accountable for their actions?
It was huge. That was the organizational shift. And it is sort of no duh. Why didn't they think of this before? But there wasn't the political pressure to do it. And then, of course, once it started working, everybody jumped on the bandwagon. And, suddenly it became a very popular thing. And, crime just kept going down and down. And they found other ways to do it. Specifically, it was August of '94 when crime fell off the table. And just, generally police departments before that would applaud a 2 or 3% reduction in crime. And then when crime went up, they would, blame society or whatever, root causes again. And then in 1994, murders went down 20%. And then the next year it went down another 25%. And these double digits decline continued for 5 years. And that was, the idea of cutting murders in half and then doing it again, it was just, no one thought it was possible, except, of course, for the people who were doing it and saying, look, it's working. And, the public saw it, not just in terms of violent crime, but also in terms of quality of life issues. People felt safer. They were safer. And, the city became a much better place. When Giuliani ran for re-election, so that would have been 97, I believe. It's a fun little footnote to history that the New York Times enthusiastically endorsed him and said of his Democratic challenger, she's basically, to paraphrase, she's asking us not to believe our lying eyes. Like, of course this is working. It was obvious to everyone who was here.
So how much of this crime reduction took place because of Rudy Giuliani putting his foot down and saying we've got to stop this, versus the police chief saying I'm going to do this?
Giuliani, I'll give him credit for appointing Bratton. Dinkins had a chance to and didn't. Remember, Giuliani fired Bratton after 2 years. I don't give him a lot of credit, other than the credit for appointing Bratton and saying we're going to care about crime. He picked it as an issue, but he picked it probably as an issue because it was effective. It could have been something else unrelated to crime had that worked first. I don't think he ever understood the philosophy behind it, but he did for all of a year sort of stay out of it and let Bratton and the people under him actually go about and do their job. So that was good. But yeah, he conflated broken windows with basically locking everybody up. The goal wasn't to make arrests. The goal was to reduce crime, and arrests were a tool. But even then, arrests in the 90s in New York City went up less under Giuliani and than it did in the 1980s with community policing. There were a lot of people who didn't like, I think, and you see this today, there were a lot of people who didn't like what was going on with the crime reduction because it showed that policing could be effective. The anti-policing brigade is not, has always been there.
So that was a factor at what sort of a level in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s, this anti-police atmosphere?
Well, everyone, it goes back even earlier to the 68 Presidential Commission on Crime in Response to Riots that kind of laid out a criminal justice model where police are the problem that need to be contained and society has problems that need to be fixed. But policing were largely taken out of the crime prevention game at the time. And that's what changed. And, Bratton will tell you it goes back to the foundation of police in London and Sir Robert Peel and the idea that the purpose of police is to maintain order and improve quality of life and prevent crime and fear of crime. And if you focus on that, you can achieve those goals.
So you said that most people feel safe, but no others unequally face crime. Is someone's personal safety a reality, or is it a state of mind?
Well, but look, some crime is hyper local and hyper segregated, and some people live in neighborhoods with, very little violent crime. I have basically zero risk of being shot here in Astoria, Queens, as I go about my life. That's not true for other people in other neighborhoods, but partly because of how important the subway is in New York, people want predictability in their commute. If there's a guy twitching, mentally deranged on the subway, maybe he won't attack me, but suddenly I have to worry about him. That is, that matters as well. No crime's going to be reported. But so even people who are, we might say, out of it, they can still behave better. They can still often understand the rules. They're smart enough usually not to pick on someone bigger than them. But there are, it's this fear concept. People are usually more afraid than arguably they should be. But fear is real and it's personal, and you don't want to discount people's fear. The right to feel safe in public, I think, is an important one. So all those things need to be addressed, but they're linked. I'm trying to give a little nuance. They're a little bit separate, but it all does tie together in terms of how a city functions.
Peter, we need to take a quick break to hear from our great sponsors. So Shay, cue those up, and we'll be right back. No channel flipping.
You're listening to Inside Track with Bruce Ash on the Live the Dream Media Network. Now a word from our sponsor.
It's termite season.
Hi, it's me.
And bugs fear the blue trucks from Essential Pest Control. Go blue at Essential Pest Control. We'll eliminate those bugs, bees, and termites. And stop paying too much to that national provider. Buy local for great service and affordable rates. Call Essential Pest Control because termites fear the blue.
Run for your life.
Call for the blue trucks from Essential Pest Control. 886-3029. That's 886-3029. Or check online at essentialpest.com.
This is Eb Wilkinson with Wilkinson Wealth Management, where we manage money for gun owners. What does it mean to retire comfortably and remain comfortably retired? It means designing a plan that allows you to do the things you want to do, outpace inflation, and never run out of money in your lifetime. If you want to retire comfortably and remain comfortably retired, call me, Eb Wilkinson, at 777-1911. That's 777-1911 or WilkinsonWealthMGMT.com.
I'm proud to welcome my good friends at Tucson Iron and Metal Retail to Inside Track as an advertiser. Jamie Kipper and her staff are conservation experts. They sell round and square steel tubing, metal plate and roofing materials, as well as new and used steel, aluminum, and stainless steel to ranchers, artists, interior designers, roofers, as well as you do-it-yourselfers out there. Tucson Iron and Metal Retail is open Monday through Fridays, 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., and Saturdays, 8 a.m. to noon. Tucson Iron and Steel Retail, 701 East 36th Street. Call 520-209-1576. That's 520-209-1576. Or go to TucsonIronRetail.com. Come by and be sure to ask for Jamie. Tucson Iron and Steel Retail. This is what conservation and repurposing is all about.
Welcome back to Inside Track with Bruce Ash on the Live the Dream Media Network. Now back to our show.
Welcome back to Inside Track with our special guest, Peter Moskos. We're talking public safety and his newest book, Back from the Brink. This portion of the show brought to you by our friend Eric Rudin at Essential Pest. So we're kind of in the middle of the broken windows and the changes that are going on in New York City. What in the heck changed over the next, say, 10 years
Decade
plus? I mean, that it's back to being fun city again, and not fun in a good way, right? Peter Moskos?
Well, crime plummeted in the late 90s, continued in the first decade, though kind of leveled out and reached a low point. Murders I'm talking about, but I look at murders because I don't trust a lot of other crime stats. Murders are reliable.
You say murders and carjackings are a good way to figure out criminal activity, right?
Yeah, people tend to report them, and these don't happen in a vacuum. If someone's saying, "Oh, crime is down but murders are up," I don't want to say they're lying, but they're mistaken. It's always all the other crime is reported crime, and a lot of it isn't reported. And some, anyway, the data is always messy, but that's why I like looking at murders and shooting numbers. Murders in New York hit a low. I mean, I can't believe that New York had fewer murders than Baltimore for a few years. Baltimore has 1/14 the population, but murders in New York got under 300, and then it kind of all went to hell under de Blasio and 2020 with the post-Floyd riots and unrest. I have to say, though, that this year, 2025, is on par for a record low number of murders. So things are trending in the right direction right now in New York. Lowest ever, at least since the 1950s or something.
There's a lot more crimes than just murder. I mean, murder is certainly a huge integer in what's going on, but there is insecurity on the streets. The shooting of the United Health Care president, lots of public disruptions as well going on in New York City. How is New York dealing with that, and how should other cities deal with it? We saw this situation, this horrible act of violence in Colorado last week, in Boulder of all places, where an illegal immigrant here, actually, he was past his visa date, killed 12 people.
Yeah, partly I think people on all sides of the political spectrum need to realize that dangerous rhetoric creates violence. Not for most people, of course. I can hear dangerous rhetoric. You, Bruce, you can hear, we're not going to go out and start shooting up people. The problem is some people are crazy, and we have to worry a little bit about what rhetoric has on those people. Everything does need to get toned down. That's part of it. But crime is local. So, I actually have like the Tucson murder stats here. One point in 2016, there were 30 murders in Tucson. Last year, I believe there were 66, down from 83, but there's no reason that couldn't be 30 again. So partly you have to look at what was the city doing right 10 years ago that resulted in half the number of people being killed compared to last year. And I don't have the answer to that because I don't know Tucson, but people got to put on their thinking caps and say, let's stop doing what isn't working and go back to what did work. But it depends on the city.
On that note, we are about 10 more murders at this point. Last year, we're about 10 more murders than we were
last year,
really,
compared to last year.
I mean, I assume that Tucson, as cities goes, it's as cities go, it's relatively red. I assume there wasn't a big defund movement in Tucson, but you can tell me.
We're very blue.
It's 7-0 Democrat City Council. It's a 4-1 Pima County Board of Supervisors, and
I stand corrected.
Yeah, the east side of Tucson has a slightly redder population than
the city
blues, and in the county it tends to be more reddish. But like I said, Pima County Board of Supervisors, they only have one out of 5 county supervisors, and all of the elected officials in Pima County are Democrats.
Okay,
Peter, let me ask you about New York and the murders. Is there a common denominator that you're seeing in the murders in New York City? I mean, is it typically bad guy on bad guy, or is it typically bad guy on good guy, or is there no set thing?
Oh, it's very typically bad guy on bad guy. The murder, the shooter, and the victim are, it's luck of the draw to a large extent, not exclusively, of course. And that is a big change from, say, 1990, when there were, I forget the number off the top of my head, but 100 people just killed in robberies alone.
Right.
That is much rarer now, which again, so that's good. I mean, I don't think anyone deserves to get murdered, but if you're playing the game, you take your chances. It certainly, it's worse to be murdered by a stranger than someone you know. It's a lot of cliques and crews. It's heavily racially disproportionate, and but the police can focus on luck. I mean, it's convenient that a lot of the shootings, there are warnings put out there on social media. The police are watching these things because it is about, they're not. It's about bravado, and you want to brag about it. So that is part of it. Part of the reason New York City has a low murder rate compared to other places, you're probably not going to like this, but I think are tough gun laws. Part of the reason is there's not much. There's almost no open there's some public drug dealing, and that's often a nexus to violence. Most of the drugs are, bought through delivery service or even a store or whatever, but it's dangerous to have people on the street slinging, and that is not very common in New York City.
Yeah, we have some interesting things going on in during COVID. The city of Tucson decided to use some of the government COVID money to make transit free. So we saw basically a spike in people using the bus to move their drugs around the city. And also
Commit crimes.
and commit crimes with like retail theft. The city, our leadership has, even though we've even had, we're having right now we're having a big problem with murders at bus stops and violence at bus stops. But our leadership is really, really deaf to these concerns.
Do middle-class people in Tucson ride public transportation?
I'd say largely not.
Largely not, unless now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right now, it's really bad to be riding public transportation unless you're homeless, drug addict, criminal. I mean, these criminals will basically plan their crimes of, retail theft around the bus schedules. So they'll grab the goods out of the Home Depot, run outside, and hop on the bus that's leaving in like 30 seconds or a minute.
I laugh only because it brings back a memory from 25 years ago in Baltimore, where a friend of mine in the academy who used to work security at one of the malls in Baltimore County in the suburbs, and he said, "Oh yeah, when a bunch of people stole some, we just stroll over to the bus stop and catch them."
Yeah, well, that's what's happening today. Just to give you some sort of a feel for our police presence in city of Tucson, in 1988, when there was only about 2/3 the number of people living inside of Tucson as there are today, there were approximately 1,450 sworn officers. Today, and the numbers are somewhat unreliable, today that number is about 700.
It's hard for me to fathom so few cops. At some point, you just don't have enough. Now, I will say I prefer to have good political leadership and support and fewer cops than a whole lot of cops and bad political leadership and support. But at some point, you're not doing more with less. You're doing less with less. You need both. You need more cops, and you need the political support. One of the lessons from the 90s crime drop in New York City is, and this you got to give Dinkins some credit for it. They hired a lot of cops, and they really boosted the numbers that had been down since the fiscal crisis of the 70s, when they actually fired cops, and that was a real disaster. So they hired thousands of cops, and then they merged 3 police departments, and so they really got those numbers up, and that gives the NYPD a luxury that if they need to muster 100 or even 1,000 cops, it's relatively easy to do that, and other cities just don't have those numbers. Because sometimes you do need a show of force, depending on the situation, of course. But it's good to have those resources, and there's so many cities now that are suffering from not enough cops, and then of course you end up lowering standards, and that's not good either. And I don't know how you get out of it.
Let's talk about that, and maybe I'm crossing the streams here in an area that you weren't going to go, but you've talked about it on other podcasts that I've watched with you. Is that the policies that come from the city councils or from the top to how to arrest people, how you can hold them, how you can't hold them, reporting, the sort of bureaucracy that goes into that. There's lots of different ways that police service can be degraded other than just taking men and women off the street, right?
Yeah, the way I look at it, my sort of litmus test, because I do think policing can be better, and other things being equal, I would like to reduce the number of people cops shoot. Not that number should be 0, but training and education, it kind of gets boring and people's eyes glaze over. Those are really important. And the culture of the department's important. But it also is important. I joke, when I was a cop, at least you had to do something wrong to get in trouble. And now you see often cops actually doing their job correctly, and someone saying, well, I don't like the way it looks. I'm talking about use of force, basically. Why did the cops have to hit that guy? Well, because they're trying to put him in cuffs and he's resisting. And that's when you need the leadership to say, no, I'm sorry if you don't like the way this looks, but this cop is in a dangerous situation and actually handled it well. Because when the cop gets thrown under the bus because there's some false public outrage, it has a horrible effect on policing. Because then a cop goes, wait a second, that could have been me. That cop was trying his hardest and actually doing the job correctly, and he's still getting in trouble. That is where the political support comes really important, is backing cops when they don't mess up. That said, cops do also mess up. And there's, sometimes it's an honest mistake. Sometimes it's a malicious mistake. And you have to, you do need police accountability. But if you come to the table and your goal is not to improve policing, I don't think you should have a seat at that table. And a lot of the sort of people who say we want to reform police, no, they don't. They want to abolish it, or at least drastically cut it back.
So what's the theory?
And if that,
What's
the theory is that police are agents of oppression and the state is bad. And, and it's not ultimately the argument falls apart, but it's some combination of anti-statist. It's some combination of far left ideology. Critical theory. But if you see police as agents of oppression and racial oppression in particular, then yeah, you'd want to get rid of them. And then society can flourish somehow. But, every time we try this, it fails. If you remember that police-free zone in Seattle, right, that was kooky. And boy, it's how quickly it failed. So yeah, if you don't think police are necessary, and at some point, good, we can debate how good, I suppose. I'll talk to lots of different people. But if you don't actually want to improve policing and you're just passing laws to limit policing and punish cops and to get them to interact with people less, if your goal is less policing, then you're not on the side of police.
So the other side of policing is the justice system. And again,
yeah, the prosecutor matters. It's super important. I was going to ask, with those shoplifters, do they get prosecuted?
No, they don't. In fact, that's another problem we have in Pima County. We have a county attorney that just absolutely refuses to prosecute.
MacArthur Foundation funded, all lefty money coming in on her election.
There's something, I used to think back in the early days of my academic career that deterrence theory was overrated. I never thought that we reached the point where people don't, of course deterrence works. People weigh, they weigh cost benefits. They know the dollar amount between misdemeanor and felony theft. If there are no consequences, of course you're going to do it more. I never thought I'd be at the position in 2025 where you have to sort of state the obvious and people go, oh, really? There's something from coming, even coming from the left, and I'm sure I'm far to the left politically than you guys, but that's okay.
We're talking.
The idea, yeah, exactly. The idea that people don't have agency seems to be a large part of this. Well, you had no choice but to shoplift. Of course you have a choice. And I want you to choose not to. And yeah, I'm willing to pay taxes so to hopefully help you in some way. But at some point, I want to smack you down when you commit a crime. You did something wrong. You deserve to be punished. That shouldn't be a left-right divide. That's just kind of a, do we live in a civil society and rule of law or anarchy divide?
No, that's earlier about New York and mentioning that it wouldn't be popular with us about firearms. I can tell you, I'm on the board of the National Rifle Association, and the largest growing population recently of firearms owners, first-time buyers, women, Democrats, blacks, gays, and lesbians. And they're all doing it for protection. And I will tell you, living in here in Arizona, and you're talking about people weighing consequences, you're not seeing break-ins into houses that are currently occupied unless it's bad guy on bad guy. And the reason is these guys know they're going to get shot. Arizona, we've got a huge legal gun ownership population going on. And it's also what they call constitutional carry. So you don't have to have a concealed carry permit if you're allowed to legally own a firearm. You can carry concealed without that permit. Now, the permit allows you other access that you wouldn't normally have, but there's a lot of crime that doesn't take place when they're walking down the street and looking at an old lady and saying, yeah, I think I'm going to not rob her. She could whack me. I'm also going to tell you the stats of when the NRA has their annual conventions, annual meetings, like we had in Atlanta in April. Whenever the NRA gathers for their annual meeting, there's about 70 to 80,000 NRA members that show up. Crime in the immediate area surrounding the convention center and for about a mile on outside drops to almost nothing.
So talk about that for a second.
Look, I want to go after illegal guns. And the far left has given up on that to some extent. Look, I carried a gun. I know most gun owners are responsible. I'm fine with that. But if you shouldn't be carrying a gun, then we don't know the numbers, and partly because we can't do research on guns easily, thanks to organizations like the NRA. I'd like to know how many gun murder, are those guns legally carried? I think very few are, but I don't know. I'm, guessing.
What do you?
So yeah. I'm sorry?
What do you mean by are those guns legally carried?
When somebody shoots, when there's a murder, a criminal homicide, I naturally assume that the shooter is not carrying legally.
That is
should
correct.
Not be carrying.
Now, if you want a good book
but I'd love to know the numbers on that. We don't. But I mean, that's what I want to go after. I want to enforce existing gun laws.
So does the NRA.
All right. Let's not make this an NRA versus the rest of the world.
No, it's not. But
let me also
for a good book.
Also add one thing.
Has two studies on that.
I'm sorry, you're cutting out a bit. I just couldn't hear that.
Yeah, John Lott did a lot of research on that and has a book out called More Guns, Less Crime.
Yeah, I am familiar with that. I would also point out, though, that different areas, I don't think that Arizona should have the same gun laws as New York. I don't want to be on a packed 6 train with people carrying when it could be so packed that, someone could, gun retention becomes an issue. I don't want arguments here. I don't want the people who get into stupid, road rage arguments to start firing on a crowded street. I think this, different cities do need different gun laws. But, I'm not going to tell what some Arizona county should do.
That's a very interesting point that you make because you're right. If you're in a packed subway train or on a busy New York City bus, I mean, nobody rides a bus here except if you're a criminal these days. But those environments that you're in, even on a crowded sidewalk going down Fifth Avenue or Park Avenue or 42nd Street or wherever you're at, there's hundreds or thousands of people depending upon the time of day or the event that you're attending. And I mean,
there's almost never a good shooting background in New York City.
No, I wouldn't think so. Let me, if I can, go back to what we're talking about, but ask you the question: how do you get the genie back into the bottle on violent crime? You've studied this. You are a teacher and educator in this area, and I know John Jay because my dad was a CID officer in the U.S. Army, and they did extension courses for all the officers who were in that division through John.
That's great.
And that was 1,000 years ago, but
yeah, we don't do much of that anymore.
but
not as the college anyway. Go on.
Well, it was wartime, so maybe that had something to do with it. But how do we as a country, or even as a city, whether it be New York City or Tucson, Arizona, how do we get that genie back in the bottle and restore order and have a population that has confidence that where they go, even in the worser neighborhoods, that they can live and not expect to get burgled or assaulted or shot at or robbed, on a regular basis. Because, if you go south of certain streets in Tucson, just like in New York City, you may be safe during the day, but at night, not the same.
Yeah, well, that genie is getting put back in the bottle in a lot of cities. Again, New York City is hopefully, knock on wood, on its way to a record low number of murders this year. And other crimes are down in sync. I just don't trust the numbers as much. But the numbers also show vast declines in other crimes as well. And that is because police are getting back in the game. And you see that in city after city. But there are certain cities, like Tucson, like Seattle, that you don't see this drop in violence. It's not something magical in the air throughout America. It's hard work at the local level. You need to, I mean, it's just a simple thing. Like, yeah, we gotta policing is an important function. It's a good function. We need to do it legally and constitutionally. Now let's go out there and do it. But there's a lot of political opposition from the far left on that, and there are consequences. What pisses me off about it is a lot of the opposition in cities come from a middle or upper middle class progressive white communities. If you ask, their poll after poll shows that Black Americans want more policing more than white Americans do. And a lot of white Americans are shocked because they've drunk the Kool-Aid of anti-policing sentiment for the past few years. Now, Black Americans also want better policing more than white Americans. They're less satisfied with the police that exist, but they want more policing because they're not stupid. Of course they do. They're at risk of being victimized. Policing is always one of the most trusted institutions in America, along with small businesses and the military. So politically to sort of assume to go into the anti-policing, but not only is it morally wrong, it's political suicide for the Democratic Party. You just have to say, look, yeah, we can police our way out of this problem. You need collaboration with prosecutors, and you mentioned that, but I've glossed over that a bit, but that's vitally important. And sometimes it is, we know this guy is a bad guy. We know he shot people. We don't have enough. We can't prove that in court yet, not beyond a reasonable doubt, but given his record, so we got him on something small. We need to put him away because he is the problem. And, who's going to applaud that are the neighbors who are terrorized by this guy. Crime doesn't happen in the abstract. And so I try and, phrase it more as an issue of moral responsibility and racial justice to focus on crime. Because, again, a lot of people aren't at risk of being victimized because they can move to safer neighborhoods. Some people are stuck there, and we have an obligation as Americans to keep Americans safe. Arguably it's the first obligation of the state.
Isn't having more police on a force a key component to keeping police officers safe in their ability to do their job? In Tucson, and Kevin, you probably...
What did you say those numbers were in Tucson again? I'm just still amazed by that. How many cops are there?
About
750.
750, yeah.
And what's the population?
About 1 million.
But out of that 750, only about 200 are actually patrolling.
Yeah. At any time.
Yeah.
I mean, Lord save you.
We have entire districts on the city downtown and west side, which aren't necessarily the best places to live or be around at night. There might only be 2 patrol cars out on duty on a typical night. Yeah, then you got...
what that means in reality is the cops are just bouncing reactively from call to call and dealing with crime after it happens and victims. And that's not... that is part of the police function, but that taking reports is not policing. And you can't police if you only have 750 cops for 1 million people. When I was in Baltimore with 600,000 population, we had close to 3,000 cops. That's way down now. And that I find hard. Like, how do they do it with 2,000? How do you do it with 750? I don't know. And I'm sure the overtime is a morale killer for policing. I'm sure there's mandatory overtime and things like that.
Oh, yeah, no question. The cop budgets, particularly the sheriff budgets, are way out of whack because of the overtime. It's, and the sheriff, who's maybe not the most responsible guy that we've had as sheriff in this county in a long time, he walks into the county supervisors and he's constantly asking for $10 million here, $8 million there. And the same things exist in the jail because they can't hire enough. They turn over like crazy. They want to go to some little town where they're going to get paid more. Same with policing, and not be subject to somebody sticking a gun in front of their face when they get out of
And you can't blame them, but I mean, I wish I had the answer to this. Somewhat, New York City has an advantage in recruiting, and they're having a tough time recruiting now, don't get me wrong. But because there's so many immigrants in New York City, a third of the city roughly is foreign born, and when you count their kids, I mean, when I teach in college, virtually everybody in my class is an immigrant or a child of immigrants. And um, they are becoming cops, and they're becoming good cops, but I bet their children might not, because as they climb the social economic ladder, their kids, will become doctors and lawyers. But so we have this, we have a great surplus of people who are really, I mean, they just want a stable job because no one in their family has ever had a job with benefits. And arguably, in terms of their character and their intellect, they're overqualified. If they grew up in a different environment, they would be going to some fancy college and not becoming a cop. So New York benefits from that. But it's still, if you can go somewhere else and get paid more and have better working conditions, I don't know what to tell them.
Peter, are there areas in New York City that the cops won't go?
No. There's no area in New York City I wouldn't go. There's some that I wouldn't want to go. But I mean, I do know what a no-go area is. I would not say that for every city.
And another question, if I might, you talked about immigrants who are becoming police officers in New York City, and I'm sure this is the same way in a lot of other major cities, because it's the large cities where so many of the new Americans are going to. And there's also lots of native-born brown and black faces in policing now. How are they viewed by the public? Because it seems like the only time we really hear about policemen and policewomen of color is when they're accused of doing something bad. But this is a huge sort of a change in the last 20 or 30 years, isn't it? With as many darker skinned police officers who are doing great jobs, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it depends on the city and where they're recruiting from, and I bet sheriff departments and states are, I do know they're much more white than an urban department in New York City. But I don't want to say it's not an issue in the NYPD anymore. But by and large, it's just, I mean, it's a majority minority department, and they're just going about their, they're not seeing everything through the lens of race. They're seeing if you can do your job, and
that's my point. They're not seeing it through the prism of race, but from the governmental standpoint, from a political standpoint, is that still an issue?
In what way do you mean? I don't quite understand.
Are police officers of color being treated differently by politicians, by the public, than white officers?
I mean, you're always going to get something. I think every black cop in America has been called an Uncle Tom at some point, and generally they just laugh it off. Some care, some don't. I don't think it's a huge issue. I do want to point out, and I've told this anecdote in other places. One of the cops I interviewed for my book, she's not in the book, but she was a former student of mine in the master's program. And when the riots in 2020 were happening, I don't know. Am I allowed to swear on this show? I don't know.
Yeah. The seven deadly words still kind of apply, but give it a shot.
It's not. I don't know if it's one of the seven. It might be number 8.
Okay.
But she's a very tall black woman, and she said, "If I have to look down at one more white bitch looking up at me, calling me a racist, I'm gonna throttle her."
The B word's perfectly acceptable here.
And she is from the city. She lives in the city. She had 25 years on at this time. And so there is that, I don't think a lot of people who are thankfully anti-police realize how well integrated and how vested in the city New York City cops are. There's this idea that they're all a bunch of white guys from Nassau or Suffolk County on Long Island, and it's just, I mean, there is that contingent, but by and large, it's just not true. Most cops live in the city or most cops do live in the city, barely, and if you count the ones that moved out after growing up here, they're New Yorkers. And they, for better and worse, they reflect that temperament. But I think the city is a little less race obsessed than a lot of other places, given our diversity here.
Fellas, any other question? We're kind of getting close on time.
I think we're over time, but that's okay.
Well, we got started a little late. Any?
No, Peter, this has been great. You're a true blessing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I want to add one thing, which is, this has been a great talk. But you know what? I want my book to be a good read. I'm not trying to teach people lessons. I want people to buy it and think it's a page turner. So,
where do they get the book?
Amazon, basically. There were some stock issues. It was a very small print run, but it did sell out for the entire month of May. But it's back in stock as of yesterday. So get it while you can. It's less than $30.
Well, and your talk with us today is bound to stimulate sales because you've really got a very good handle on the issues. About this topic, and I think that comes out loud and clear.
Great. The book is Back from the Brink, inside the NYPD and the extraordinary 1990s crime drop.
It's a good one. Insiders, that's going to do it for
you.
Check out our Facebook and Exit pages for the latest news and our views on the news. All of our Inside Track podcasts are available live on Live the Dream Media on Facebook. Thanks for joining us today. Until next Wednesday when we return, this is Bruce Ash.
Ed Wilkinson.
And
Kevin Daly.
Wishing you a very good rest of your morning. Be sure to join us again in 167 hours.